In 1944, inside the limestone caves of Peleliu, the air was hot, humid, and stank of decay. A corporal in the Imperial Japanese Army, now skeletal, survived on stagnant water and the occasional rat. His unit was enduring a relentless American bombardment, a never-ending thunder. During a lull in the fighting, he risked crawling out to find food and stumbled upon a recently abandoned American position. He hoped for scraps, anything to sustain life. But what he saw shattered his soul more completely than any battlefield horror. There were half-eaten cans of Spam, the meat still glistening with fat, discarded, perfectly packaged ration boxes, countless empty Coca-Cola bottles. And most incomprehensibly, around some cartons were melted, sweet, sticky residues drawing armies of ants. It was ice cream. On this hellish 100-degree Fahrenheit front line, the enemy was eating ice cream. In that moment, the corporal realized that all the Bushido spirit, all the Yamato Damashi spirit of Japan, was powerless against this overwhelming, almost absurd material superiority. When the enemy treats luxuries as trash on the front line while you can't even find tree bark to eat, the war is already lost. This wasn't a contest of soldier against soldier, it was a public execution by national productivity. And the Empire of Japan was being drowned by the awakened American logistical monster. The narrative of the Pacific War usually focuses on the carrier battles of Midway or the bloody landings on Iwo Jima. But behind these battles lies a more critical story, the War of Logistics. It's a story of how Japan self-destructed through arrogance, and how America transformed its industrial might into a devastating psychological weapon. It's the story of how ice cream broke the enemy's will to fight more effectively than bullets. To understand the impact of American logistics, we must first delve into the mindset of the Imperial Japanese Army, IJA. This was an army built on extreme spiritualism, harboring an almost suicidal contempt for the realities of modern industrial warfare. The core belief of this philosophy was that spiritual power, seishin, could overcome material disadvantage. This stemmed from a tradition of Bushido twisted by extreme nationalism, emphasizing sacrifice, endurance, and absolute loyalty to the emperor. This ideology was known as seishin shugi, spiritualism. Under this ideology, reliance on material supply was seen as a weakness. Western armies were ridiculed as coddled, unable to fight without steady food and comfort. The IJA's field manual, the Senjin-kun Code of Battlefield Conduct, emphasized, endure what seems unendurable, eat what seems inedible. This philosophy led to an institutionalized contempt for logistics, known as Haitan Keishi, disregard for logistics. The logistics branch, the quartermaster corps, held very low status in the Japanese military hierarchy. At the military academy, the best graduates chose infantry or artillery. Logistics was considered the destination for failures. A sarcastic saying circulated at the time, if a quartermaster is a soldier, then butterflies and dragonflies are eagles. Senior commanders believed logistics were something junior officers should worry about. Their duty was to devise bold offensive strategies. The notorious Masanobu Tsuji, chief of operations at the Army General Staff, epitomized this mindset. He openly declared that a lack of supplies could be overcome with unwavering conviction of victory. Japan developed this mindset partly due to their experiences in the Russo-Japanese War and on the Chinese battlefield. In these wars, Japan achieved victory despite material inferiority, leaving them with a fatal misconception that spiritual power was decisive. Their logistical planning was often based on genshi jisho, living off the land, essentially looting. In the vast agricultural regions of China, this strategy was somewhat feasible. But in the Pacific, they faced vast oceans and resource-poor tropical islands. More importantly, they never planned for a prolonged war of attrition. Their goal was to quickly seize resources, establish a defensive perimeter, and force the United States to negotiate. This led to the neglect of crucial areas, particularly the construction and protection of the merchant fleet. They almost completely ignored anti-submarine warfare, ASW, considering the protection of supply ships cowardly. This left Japan's lifeline extremely vulnerable to American submarines. As the war progressed, the U.S. submarine force effectively strangled Japan's economy and military operations, sinking over 1,300 Japanese merchant ships. The island nation of Japan was cut off. The catastrophic consequences of Japan's logistical philosophy were most brutally demonstrated in the Guadalcanal campaign. This battle was the turning point of the Pacific War and a logistical nightmare. When the U.S. gained control of the air and sea, Japan couldn't resupply the island's troops with conventional transports. They relied on fast destroyer runs at night, the Tokyo Express. But destroyers are not cargo ships. They couldn't carry heavy artillery, vehicles, or sufficient food and medicine. Supplies were often packed in sealed drums and thrown overboard, hoping the troops ashore could retrieve them. Historian Richard B. Frank estimates that less than 30% of the supplies transported this way actually reached the soldiers. Guadalcanal soon became known to Japanese soldiers as Gato, Starvation Island. The situation on the island rapidly deteriorated into a living hell. Tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers were trapped in the jungle, their daily rations reduced from a few spoonfuls of rice to nothing. They began eating everything they could find: coconuts, roots, snakes, rats, even dirt. Tropical diseases, malaria, dengue fever, dysentery ran rampant. Lacking basic medical supplies, a minor wound could be fatal. Survivors' diaries paint a horrific picture. One soldier wrote, "I cannot describe the hunger I experienced. We staggered when we walked, like ghosts. Our only thought was food." Courage and spiritual power meant nothing here. As hunger intensified, discipline collapsed. Soldiers were no longer warriors. They became desperate foragers. Horrifying rumors of cannibalism began to spread and were confirmed after the war. The statistics tell the story. Of the approximately 30,000 Japanese soldiers who died on Guadalcanal, only about 9,000 died in combat. The remaining two-thirds died of starvation and disease. Tamichi Hara, a famous Japanese destroyer captain, wrote in his memoir Japanese Destroyer Captain that he was shocked when he saw the soldiers evacuated from Guadalcanal. They were emaciated, skeletal. "They looked like ghosts from another world," he wrote. "At that moment, I deeply doubted whether we could win this war." Shockingly, the Japanese army learned almost nothing from the disaster at Guadalcanal. The same pattern repeated in the New Guinea campaign, where the jungles were even harsher and the supply lines longer. The most extreme example was perhaps the Imphal offensive in 1944, when the Japanese attempted to invade India from Burma. The commander of this offensive, Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, was a fanatical believer in the spirit over matter philosophy. When his logistics officers raised concerns about the supply lines, Mutaguchi contemptuously dismissed them. His solution was the infamous Genghis Khan plan. The troops would drive herds of cattle as mobile food sources through the jungle. The plan failed almost immediately. When the offensive stalled and starvation set in again, Mutaguchi sent a message to his troops that has become synonymous with military incompetence. The Japanese have always been a herbivorous people. If you cannot find food in the jungle, eat grass. The Imphal offensive was the largest land defeat in the history of the Japanese army. Over half of the soldiers involved died of starvation and disease. This catastrophic neglect of logistics not only killed soldiers, but also began to erode the ideological foundation they were fighting for. It's hard to believe you are part of a superior race when you are starving enough to eat your comrades. Japan's military machine was consuming itself from within. They were about to face a very different enemy, one that viewed war as an industrial project. In stark contrast to Japan's contempt for logistics, the United States viewed the war as an industrial and organizational challenge. President Roosevelt called America the arsenal of democracy, a title that referred not just to weapons production but to the entire economic system supporting the war effort. The scale of American industrial capacity was unprecedented and fundamentally incomprehensible to Japan. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, they awakened a giant. The transformation of the U.S. economy was unparalleled in history. Automobile factories were converted to produce tanks and aircraft. The scale of this mobilization was staggering. Ford Motor Company built the massive Willow Run plant in Michigan, which, at its peak, produced a B-24 Liberator heavy bomber every 63 minutes. In shipbuilding, entrepreneur Henry J. Kaiser revolutionized the industry. His shipyards applied assembly line techniques, producing over 2,700 Liberty ships. These were prefabricated cargo ships, designed to be built quickly and cheaply. At the peak, a ship was launched every 42 days on average. In November 1942, they set an astonishing record. The SS Robert E. Peary went from keel laying to launch in just 4 days and 15 hours. This torrent of productivity meant the U.S. could absorb losses and replenish them rapidly. If a tank was destroyed, 10 were ready to replace it. This production capacity itself was a strategic weapon. But producing these materials was only half the challenge. The real challenge was transporting them across thousands of miles of the Pacific theater. The distances were brutal. To overcome these challenges, the U.S. developed revolutionary logistical systems. They didn't just transport supplies, they reinvented how to transport them. A crucial, but often overlooked innovation was the revolution in material handling. In the early days of the war, cargo was loaded and unloaded manually, a slow and inefficient process. The U.S. military adopted the widespread use of pallets and forklifts. It sounds simple, but it was revolutionary at the time. It increased the speed of cargo handling several times over, drastically reducing the turnaround time for ships in port. At sea, one of the most important innovations was the development of the floating base. Recognizing they couldn't rely on land bases, the Navy created massive service squadrons that could support the combat fleet entirely at sea. The most famous of these was Service Squadron 10. It was stationed in remote atolls like Ulithi, which were transformed into vast floating cities. Ulithi became the largest naval base in the world in late 1944. Hundreds of ships were anchored in the lagoon. There were floating dry docks capable of repairing battleships, repair ships, hospital ships, tankers, and massive warehouses. Simultaneously, the technique of underway replenishment, UNREP, was perfected, allowing ships to transfer fuel, ammunition, and supplies while moving. This enabled the U.S. fleet to stay at sea for months, maintaining constant pressure on Japan. In contrast, the Japanese Navy, lacking this capability, had to return to base frequently, severely limiting its operational effectiveness. Another significant manifestation of American logistical power was its engineering capability. While the Japanese Army relied on manpower and simple tools, the Americans brought heavy machinery and transformed the battlefield environment at an unprecedented speed. The vanguard of this effort was the Naval Construction Battalion Seabees, from the initials CB. Their motto was, "Can Do." The Seabees were composed of experienced construction workers and engineers. Their mission was to build the infrastructure needed for war, airfields, ports, roads, bridges, and barracks from scratch, often under enemy fire. Their capabilities were astonishing. On Pacific islands, the Seabees often landed with the first wave of assault troops. While the Marines were still securing the beachhead, the Seabees were already unloading bulldozers, graders, and cranes. They could turn a jungle into a fully functional airbase in a matter of days. The contrast in construction speed was stark and demoralizing. The Japanese might take months to build an airfield with hand tools, only to see the Americans complete the same task in days with machines. On Tinian in the Mariana Islands, the Seabees built the largest airfield in the world at the time, with 6 runways for B-29 Superfortress bombers to attack the Japanese mainland. It was from here that the Enola Gay took off to drop the first atomic bomb. This engineering capability was a tangible demonstration of American logistical power. A Japanese officer wrote in a report, "The enemy's strength lies not in their soldiers, but in their bulldozers." The U.S. logistical system wasn't just efficient, it was overwhelming. It aimed to provide soldiers with everything they needed and more. This leads to the strangest and most psychologically impactful aspect of the American logistical arsenal: how they used affluence to boost morale. America's philosophy of war stood in stark contrast to Japan's asceticism. U.S. military leadership recognized that morale was a critical component of combat effectiveness. Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall emphasized, "Morale is the single most important factor in war." The American philosophy was, "A well-fed, well-cared-for soldier is a more effective fighter." In the hellish conditions of the Pacific, anything that could boost morale was considered vital. This meant providing not just basic necessities, but also luxuries. Food was paramount. While Japanese soldiers survived on a small ball of rice a day, American soldiers consumed 4,000 to 5,000 calories daily. The most iconic item was Spam. It was cheap, stable, protein-rich, and didn't require refrigeration. The U.S. government purchased millions of pounds of Spam. For American soldiers, Spam was ubiquitous. They hated it. There were countless jokes and complaints about Spam, but it sustained them and became a symbol of American abundance. But the U.S. military wasn't content with canned food. They established a massive cold chain logistics system to deliver fresh meat, vegetables, and eggs deep into the Pacific. On Thanksgiving and Christmas, the military went to great lengths to provide traditional turkey dinners. Imagine eating turkey on a remote Pacific island while you know the enemy is starving in the jungle a few miles away. Perhaps nothing symbolized American logistical power and commitment to morale more than Coca-Cola. At the outbreak of the war, Robert Woodruff, the president of the Coca-Cola Company, made an extraordinary commitment. We will see that every man in uniform gets a bottle of Coca-Cola for 5 cents, wherever he is, and whatever it costs the company. This wasn't just a PR stunt. It was a major logistical operation. The Coca-Cola Company dispatched technical observers, known as Coca-Cola colonels, to the front lines to set up and operate bottling plants. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was a true believer in Coca-Cola. In 1943, during the North Africa campaign, he sent an urgent cable requesting 3 million bottles of Coca-Cola and complete bottling equipment capable of producing twice that amount monthly. In the Pacific, Coca-Cola became a symbol of home. For soldiers on the front lines, drinking a cold Coke was a powerful psychological boost. By the end of the war, the U.S. military had established 64 Coca-Cola bottling plants worldwide. But the ultimate luxury that exemplified the extreme reach of American logistics was undoubtedly ice cream. In the sweltering heat of the Pacific, ice cream was the ultimate extravagance. The U.S. Navy's obsession with ice cream has historical roots. It dates back to 1914, when Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels banned alcohol on naval vessels. To compensate for this loss and boost morale, the Navy began installing ice cream machines on ships. In World War II, ice cream was considered essential. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal declared, "Ice cream is one of the most important morale factors in this war." Large warships had their own ice cream factories, known as steel cows. This created an unexpected hierarchy and incentive system. Pilots were often rewarded with a pint of ice cream for shooting down an enemy plane. When a destroyer rescued a downed carrier pilot, the traditional reward was not a medal, but a gallon of ice cream. In the Battle of the Coral Sea in 1942, the USS Lexington aircraft carrier was sunk. As the crew abandoned ship, the last thing they did was raid the ice cream storage, eating as much as they could before jumping into the water. This speaks volumes about the importance of ice cream. As the war progressed, the demand for ice cream far exceeded the supply. The Army and Marines wanted ice cream too. The solution was innovation. Air Force pilots found ingenious ways to make ice cream on their planes. They would put ice cream ingredients in a can strapped to the aircraft. At high altitudes, the low temperature would freeze the ingredients, and the intense vibration would churn it. But the Navy needed a larger-scale solution. So, they launched an extraordinary project: the construction of ice cream barges. These vessels, officially known as Barge, refrigerated, large, BRL, were floating factories specifically designed to produce and store ice cream in the war zone. Due to steel shortages, these barges were built of concrete and cost over $1 million each. They could produce 500 gallons of ice cream per hour and store 2,000 gallons. They were towed to anchorages across the Pacific, serving smaller vessels and island bases. The appearance of these ice cream barges was surreal. Amid the brutality of war, these floating dessert factories operated day and night. The U.S. commitment to morale wasn't limited to food. They tried to maintain a sense of normalcy in the war zone. Mobile cinemas screened the latest Hollywood movies. The USO sent stars to perform in the war zone. The efficient V-mail system ensured the rapid delivery of letters from home. In major rear bases, specialized recreational facilities were established. For example, in Ulithi Atoll, a small island called Mogmog was designated as the recreation island. Soldiers and sailors could rest there, drink beer limited to 3 cans a day, play baseball, and enjoy a moment of peace. The cumulative effect of all these efforts was the creation of the best-equipped, best-supplied army in history. But it wasn't just about keeping American soldiers happy. It was a statement of power. It sent a clear message: we have so many resources that we can provide you with luxuries in combat. If a nation can do this, what can it do in terms of producing bombs, tanks, and aircraft? This is what terrified the Japanese soldiers. Ultimately, America's overwhelming logistical advantage was more than just a material factor. It became the most powerful psychological weapon in the Pacific War. It systematically destroyed the Japanese soldiers' will to fight and shook their faith in their own culture and ideology. For the average Japanese soldier, contact with the American logistical machine was a shocking and demoralizing experience. They had been taught to believe they were spiritually superior, while Americans were decadent and weak. But the reality they encountered was drastically different. One of the most psychologically damaging aspects was what we mentioned at the beginning: the garbage dump phenomenon, the casual way Americans treated supplies. People raised in a culture of scarcity, emphasizing frugality and sacrifice, couldn't comprehend the wastefulness of the U.S. military. Japanese soldiers would risk their lives to retrieve a single bullet because they knew it was irreplaceable. In contrast, they saw the U.S. military discarding perfectly usable equipment. If a truck broke down, instead of spending time repairing it, they would push it into a ditch and get a new one. They saw the U.S. military discarding vast amounts of food. This wastefulness seemed incredible, even offensive to the Japanese. But it also sent a powerful message. We have more than we need. We can afford to be wasteful. A U.S. psychological warfare expert later wrote, "We didn't need to tell the Japanese they were losing the war. We just needed to let them see our garbage dumps." This highlighted the fundamental gap between the two nations. Japan was fighting a total war, where every nail, every grain of rice was mobilized. America seemed to be fighting a war of affluence. The impact of the war on the U.S. mainland was relatively minor, and the economy was booming. As the war continued, Japanese soldiers began to realize they were not just fighting soldiers, but a vast industrial machine. They began to use the term butsuryo, material volume, to describe America's overwhelming material superiority. This realization was reflected in combat. The gap in firepower was overwhelming. In the Battle of Okinawa, the intense American bombardment was called the Typhoon of Steel by the Japanese. The sheer volume of shells was so great that it changed the landscape. It felt like the enemy's resources were infinite. There was also a huge gap in infantry firepower. The American M1 Garand semi-automatic rifle had a much higher rate of fire than the Japanese Arisaka bolt-action rifle. This gave American soldiers a significant advantage in close combat. Japanese soldiers often launched desperate banzai charges, trying to overcome American firepower with spiritual strength. But these charges almost always resulted in mass slaughter. They were easily mowed down, not because they weren't brave enough, but because they couldn't fight against the torrent of metal. When Japanese soldiers faced this reality, their psychological response went through several stages. First was shock and disbelief. The evidence before their eyes completely contradicted the propaganda. Then came envy. They saw the enemy well-fed and well-equipped while they were suffering. This envy often turned into resentment towards their own leaders. They felt deceived. But eventually, envy turned into despair. They realized that no matter how bravely they fought, they could not overcome this industrial might. The famous Japanese ace pilot Saburo Sakai described this feeling in his memoir. Late in the war, when he saw countless American planes darkening the sky like a cloud, he wrote, "I realized we were fighting an industrial behemoth beyond our imagination. For every plane shot down, 10 new ones would replace it." This sense of despair permeated all levels of the Japanese military. Senior commanders realized it too. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had foreseen this early in the war, having lived in the U.S. and witnessed its industrial potential firsthand. He warned, "I can run wild for 6 months in the Pacific. After that, I have no confidence in victory." One of the most striking manifestations of the logistical gap was the quality of medical care. The U.S. military had an efficient medical system that dramatically increased the survival rate of wounded soldiers. Key innovations included the mass production of penicillin and the use of dried blood plasma, making blood transfusions possible on the battlefield. In contrast, the Japanese medical system was primitive. Medicines were chronically short. Japanese soldiers knew that being wounded often meant a slow and painful death. Another critical gap was the personnel replacement system. The U.S. military could quickly replenish combat losses and regularly rotate frontline troops to prevent combat fatigue. Soldiers knew they wouldn't be left on the front line indefinitely. The Japanese army had no systematic rotation policy. Units were often left on the front line until they were completely annihilated. This asymmetry of suffering had a devastating impact on morale. The most devastating realization was that the enemy wasn't even suffering in the fight. American soldiers might be uncomfortable at times, but they weren't starving. They had ice cream. This was perhaps the ultimate insult. Japanese soldiers were taught that war was a test of suffering and sacrifice. But they were not prepared to face an enemy that could wage war comfortably. For those Japanese soldiers taken prisoner, the culture shock was even more intense. They were taken to POW camps where they received hot meals, clean clothes, and medical care. For many, it was the first time they had eaten a full meal in years. A Japanese soldier captured in the Philippines later wrote, "In the POW camp, I tasted chocolate for the first time. It was so delicious that I cried. I thought of my starving family in Japan. At that moment, my faith in the war completely collapsed." This experience had a profound impact on many POWs. They began to question the ideology they had been fighting for. In a way, the atomic bomb can be seen as the ultimate manifestation of American logistical and industrial superiority. The Manhattan Project was enormously expensive and mobilized hundreds of thousands of people. It was an undertaking that only a nation with a massive industrial base like the U.S. could afford. The atomic bomb was not just a devastating weapon, but the ultimate symbol of America's overwhelming industrial advantage. It finally convinced the Japanese leaders that continuing the war was futile. The Pacific War was a brutal conflict, but ultimately, the outcome was determined not by individual bravery, but by national industrial strength and organizational capability. The war brutally proved that in modern industrialized warfare, logistics is combat power. Spiritual strength cannot fill empty stomachs, nor can it stop bullets. The failure of the Empire of Japan was not due to a lack of courage. Their failure was because they chose to ignore the material realities of war. They believed spiritual power could overcome the laws of physics. They were wrong. America's victory was not just a military victory, but an industrial victory, an organizational victory, a logistical victory. As General Omar Bradley said, amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. What crushed the Empire of Japan was not just aircraft carriers and atomic bombs, but ice cream barges, Coca-Cola bottling plants, Spam cans, and bulldozers. The ice cream wasn't just for morale, it was a statement of power. It was a psychological weapon that conveyed American strength more effectively than any propaganda. When that starving Japanese soldier saw the melted ice cream in the garbage dump on Peleliu, he saw the fate of his nation. He saw an enemy with infinite resources, an enemy he could not defeat. In modern warfare, affluence itself is a weapon. The United States wielded this weapon on an unprecedented scale in the Pacific War, utterly destroying the enemy's will to fight. This war left us with an enduring lesson. Never start a war with a nation that can build floating ice cream factories in a war zone. Do you think that in modern warfare, technology and logistics have completely surpassed the importance of individual soldiers' courage and morale? Is there still a place for ideology in the face of industrial might? Share your thoughts in the comments. Summer 1945. Ulithi Atoll, Pacific Ocean. The sea breeze is hot, the needle on the thermometer pushes past 40 degrees Celsius, and the air is thick with the smell of salt, moldy canvas, and heavy oil. This is a massive maritime staging ground. Hundreds of U.S. warships are packed tightly together, a forest of steel preparing for the final assault on the Japanese home islands. In the middle of this steel jungle, a strange-looking ship is slowly docking. It is incredibly ugly, like a giant, floating gray brick. It has no streamlined hull because it is cast from concrete. It has no large-caliber main guns, nor does it carry fighter jets. But the moment it drops anchor, guess what happens? The sailors on the dozens of surrounding warships, men who have just survived the suicide attacks of the kamikaze, erupt in cheers louder than if they had sunk an enemy battleship. Some sailors even throw their hats into the sky and whistle. If a Japanese officer were spying from a distant island with binoculars at that moment, he would be utterly confused. What is that ship for? Is it delivering a new type of bomb? Why are the Americans so excited? The answer would have crushed him perhaps even more than the atomic bomb, making him feel that this war was impossible to win. The ship's codename is USS Quartz. It cost $1 million to build, that's $1,945, equivalent to about $15 million today. Its belly is not filled with gunpowder, but with massive refrigeration compressors, mixers, and generators. Its mission is singular, in the sweltering heat of the equator, to produce 500 gallons of vanilla ice cream every hour for the frontline troops. Yes, you heard that right. While hundreds of kilometers away, Japanese soldiers were eating lizards and gnawing on tree bark, sometimes even boiling their leather belts to stave off hunger their opponents. The American GIs were lying on deck complaining that today's ice cream was a little too melty or didn't have enough chocolate sauce. This is a story about a spiritual atom bomb. Today, we aren't talking about the smoke of Pearl Harbor or the madness of the kamikaze. We are talking about how a spoonful of sugar, a cup of milk, and a refrigeration machine thoroughly shattered the Yamato spirit, the spiritual backbone of Imperial Japan. On a psychological level, this is the ultimate showdown between ice cream and Bushido. To understand the cruelty of this showdown, we must move the camera away from this sweet ice cream ship and cut to the darkest corner of the war. Let's go to Guadalcanal. The Japanese called it Starvation Island. Rewind to late 1942. For the Japanese army, this was the 18th level of hell. When they first landed, Commander Hyakutake was full of confidence, believing that the Imperial Army's Bushido spirit would easily drive the soft American soldiers into the sea. But they miscalculated one thing: logistics. The U.S. controlled the air and the sea. Japanese transport ships couldn't get anywhere near the shore. The elite troops who had swept through Southeast Asia began to face an enemy far more terrifying than American machine guns: hunger. In Japanese field diaries, we find entries like this. October 20. Today's ration is 1 grain of rice. Not a bowl, 1 grain. Soldiers began eating wild grass and moss. Later, when the grass was gone, they hunted lizards and rats. In the end, even those were gone. A famous survivor, Shohei Uka, who later became a writer, recalled that in the jungle, if you saw a comrade fall, your first reaction wasn't sadness. It was to stare at his thighs and wonder if that was meat. Extreme hunger had turned men into beasts. To maintain morale, the Japanese High Command sent a famous telegram that read, "The Imperial Army can fight even eating grass." Listen to that sentence. Can fight even eating grass. This wasn't just strategic incompetence. It was contempt for humanity. They elevated spiritual power to an infinite height, trying to fill empty stomachs with fanaticism in the brain. But in the same ocean, on the other side of the horizon, the Americans were doing the exact opposite. The U.S. Department of the Navy was holding an emergency meeting in Washington. The agenda wasn't about ammunition. It was about how to make soldiers more comfortable. The Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, slammed his hand on the table and delivered a famous line. "In my opinion, ice cream is the most important factor in morale, second only to cigarettes." Why were Americans so obsessed with ice cream? There is a historical reason. In 1914, the U.S. Navy issued General Order 99, banning alcohol on warships. The U.S. Navy became a dry navy. For sailors drifting at sea for months under immense pressure, without alcohol, they needed a new outlet, a new source of dopamine. So, sugar became the new alcohol. In 1942, the U.S. Navy issued a directive. All large vessels, battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers must be equipped with ice cream machines. This was listed as standard equipment, just as important as guns. Even submarines and destroyers, ships with extremely cramped space, found ways to cram small ice makers into corners of the engine rooms. Imagine this scene. Inside a submarine, outside is the crushing pressure and silence of the deep sea. In the sweltering cabin, a submariner holds a cup of freshly made ice cream. That sweetness, that cold touch, is his only link to the civilized world. It reminds these young men, you are not beasts, you are cared for by your country. The life you left at home hasn't abandoned you. As the battle line stretched and the number of U.S. troops in the Pacific swelled to millions, the small machines on warships couldn't keep up. Reports from frontline commanders asked for 2 things: bullets and ice cream powder. Faced with this demand, the powerful American industrial machine once again displayed its financial superpower. If small machines aren't enough, let's build a ship dedicated to it. This is the monster we mentioned at the beginning, the BRL-class concrete barge. BRL stands for Barge, Refrigerated, Large. This ship was a miracle of logistics, or perhaps the ultimate flex of wealth. Since steel was prioritized for carriers and tanks, the hull was cast from reinforced concrete. It had no engine and had to be towed by tugboats like a moving castle on the sea. Walk inside, and you'd feel like you traveled to a food processing plant in Chicago. The first deck was a massive freezer, hanging with top-quality beef, turkeys, and bacon, shipped from Australia and the U.S., along with fresh vegetables. The second deck was dry storage, piled high with flour, coffee beans, and sugar. But the core was the fully automated ice cream production line. Seawater was pumped up, turned into fresh water through a distillation system, and then mixed with milk powder, sugar, and vanilla extract. Giant mixers roared, condensation frosting the pipes. The machine spat out a gallon of finished product every 7 seconds. The ship's capacity was 5,000 gallons a day. What does that mean? It was enough for a full army division to have a large cup each, with plenty left over. When this ship was towed to a forward base, it became a giant magnet. Small boats swarmed around it like flies. War correspondents described it as the most heartwarming yet absurd scene on the battlefield. The background was a distant island being bombarded by artillery. The foreground was a group of American sailors in shorts, standing in long lines, holding mess kits, waiting for their combat rations. This extreme material abundance didn't just change soldiers' stomachs, it changed the rules of the battlefield. In the Pacific Fleet, an unwritten rule formed, something we call ice cream economics. You see, in naval warfare, aircraft carrier pilots are the most valuable assets, but takeoffs and landings are dangerous, and pilots often crashed into the sea. The destroyers on escort duty would rush over to fish them out. By regulation, the rescued pilot had to be returned to his carrier, but destroyer captains discovered a business opportunity. They would radio the carrier. "Hey, we have your ace pilot Tom aboard. He's drinking hot coffee and doing fine. You want him back?" The carrier would understand the code immediately. "What do you want?" "Our canteen is empty. 20 gallons of ice cream, strawberry flavor. Deal?" "Deal." This isn't a joke, it is real history. The ransom for a standard pilot was about 20 gallons of ice cream. If it was an ace or a squadron leader, the price might go up to 40 gallons, or maybe a few cases of whiskey, even if it was contraband. The U.S. military treated this trade as battlefield fun, a game for the strong. But on the other side of this game, what was the Japanese perspective? Let's look at a true story. 1944. The Battle of Saipan. It was a brutal fight, ending with the Japanese launching a final banzai charge, thousands of men in a suicide attack. After the battle, a young Japanese officer was scavenging the battlefield when he stumbled upon a backpack left by a U.S. soldier. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. He opened the pack looking for food. He found a K ration. When he opened that waterproof cardboard box, he froze. Inside was a tin of luncheon meat, a feast fit for New Year's in his eyes. But what shocked him more was that there was also chocolate, chewing gum, a packet of instant lemon powder, a pack of cigarettes, and several sheets of soft toilet paper. What broke him completely was a letter tucked inside. It read, "Dear John, the dog had puppies. Hope you are well over there. Enclosed are your favorite cookies." This Japanese officer wrote a passage in his diary that has been cited by many historians as evidence of the collapse of Japan's psychological defenses. We were told that the Americans were soft, spoiled, rich boys who couldn't handle hardship, and that if we showed our determination to die, they would run. But when I looked at the chocolate and chewing gum in my hand, looking at the exquisite packaging, I suddenly realized we are fighting a monster. They not only possess the weapons to destroy us, but they also have the spare capacity to care about their soldiers' teeth and tastes. We are preaching death for the emperor, drinking muddy water and eating roots. The enemy is thinking about how to make their soldiers live like human beings. When I saw that they even had special coolers for Coca-Cola, I knew the empire had lost. Not for lack of courage, but because we are not even in the same dimension. This is cognitive collapse. To the Japanese soldier, American power wasn't just the ice cream ship itself. It was the massive, precise, and desperately wealthy industrial civilization behind it. The spirit theory lie spun by the Japanese propaganda machine melted faster than snow in the face of a spoonful of ice cream. By the late war, this material humiliation became a weapon of psychological warfare. On Okinawa, U.S. troops would blast jazz music over loudspeakers and let the smell of barbecue drift into Japanese tunnels. They shouted, "Japanese soldiers, surrender. We have hot coffee and ice cream here." At first, Japanese officers said it was a trick, that if they surrendered, they'd be crushed by tanks. But as starvation reached its limit, more and more Japanese soldiers crawled out of their trenches at night, walking toward the American lines. They didn't do it for democracy or freedom. They did it for that taste of sweetness. Statistics show that a significant number of surrendered Japanese soldiers admitted they were seduced by American food. One prisoner, after eating a piece of bread given by a GI, wept uncontrollably, saying it was the softest thing he had ever eaten in his life. The 15th of August, 1945, Japan surrendered unconditionally. The million-dollar USS Quartz completed its historical mission. It was later towed away, perhaps converted into a regular cold storage barge, slowly rusting into oblivion. But the shockwave it created didn't end. Post-war Japan was in ruins. When U.S. troops occupied the country, jeeps drove through the streets of Tokyo. A famous historical scene emerged. A group of Japanese children in tattered clothes running after U.S. jeeps, shouting in broken English, "Give me chocolate, give me chocolate." American GIs would smile and toss down Hershey bars and gum. This scene was etched into the memory of Japan's post-war generation. This was actually the continuation of the war. If the ice cream ship shattered the Bushido of the Japanese soldier on the battlefield, then these chocolates conquered the next generation of Japan after the war. It represented a longing for American-style wealth, sweetness, and modern life. This conquest of soft power was more durable than any garrison. Looking back at this history, what do we learn? World War II is often described as a battle between good and evil, or a contest of strategy and tactics. But if we peel back grand narratives, you find that the base color of war is math, physics, and logistics. The defeat of the Japanese Empire was sealed the moment they decided to let their soldiers eat grass. They tried to use a spiritual atom bomb to fight against real steel and supplies and arrogance that defied humanity. And the Americans, with an absurd ice cream ship, taught the world a brutal lesson. Modern warfare isn't about who is less afraid to die. It's about who can keep their soldiers living better, longer, and with more dignity. That USS Quartz docked at Ulithi Atoll was like a tombstone on the sea. It buried not only the ambition of the Axis powers but also the old logic of war that treated human life like grass. Next time you open the freezer and take out a tub of ice cream, think about this story. That spoonful of sweetness in your hand was once the deadliest weapon in the Pacific. That's the story for today. If you like this perspective of looking at grand history through logistics and small objects, let me know in the comments. I am your history observer. See you next time.